Right. Well, I think we can get started. Thank you so much for joining the National Down Syndrome Society for today's webinar, Down Syndrome, the Specific Learning Profile. We're thrilled to have you here to learn some more about students with Down syndrome and best practices. My name is Jessica Kuss, and I'm the Senior Manager of Education Programs here at NDSS. I am also a former special education teacher in Fairfax County, Virginia, where I currently live. I have two children, and my youngest, who is 10, has Down syndrome. Before we get into all of the content today, I just have a few things to go over to make sure everybody has a great experience throughout the webinar. If you are having any technical issues during the webinar, you can feel free to please use the chat function to notify our support team, and they will do their best to assist you in a timely manner. We will answer questions at the end of the webinar. So if you would like to submit your questions throughout, use the Q&A feature, which is located near the bottom of the screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. If we're unable to answer your questions during the event, or if you have specific questions, I will be sharing an email at the end of the webinar that you may use to contact us, and I will be sure to follow up with answers to those questions we cannot get to. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be shared on the NDSS YouTube channel and the NDSS website within a few days. You should receive an email with the link within a couple days and the links to some of the resources that we are mentioning in today's presentation. Thank you for your attention. We're going to get started. I'm going to toss it over to my colleague, Charlotte Woodward, who is our NDSS Programs Associate, and she's going to go over a little bit about NDSS. Charlotte?
Hi, my name is Charlotte Woodward. So at the National Down Syndrome Society, our mission is to empower individuals with Down syndrome and their families by driving policy change, providing resources, engaging with local communities, and shifting public perceptions. Next slide, please. So we have several core programs at NDSS. We have resources and support, advocacy and policy, and community engagement. And these are the three areas of programming that we're focused on. Next slide, please. So the education program has a lot of ways in which we help our members, whether it be individuals with Down syndrome, parents, caregivers, etc. For the resources, we have resources for families and professionals, as well as teacher trainings. We also provide support to families and caregivers when IEPs are being made. We are also big on education policy and advocacy, since we look at the systemic side of things, and we also support our local affiliates and collaboration. You can also access the education helpline and email, which is education@ndss.org. Next slide, please. We are one big happy family here at NDSS, and that includes going to many events. Some of the events that we put on are the Times Square Video and New York City Buddy Walk. We also do a golf outing, and there's also the NDSS Adult Summit. We also have a Racing for 321 and the Down Syndrome Advocacy Conference. I urge you to join us. Next slide, please. For those of you who don't know me, I am a recent college graduate. I graduated in 2022 from George Mason University with a degree in sociology with a concentration in inequality and social change, summa cum laude. I had an IEP all throughout my K through 12 schooling, and a goal of mine that was included in all of my IEPs was to go to college after I graduated from high school. This sent the message to my IEP team that higher education was a priority for me, and that my family and I expected the school to have high expectations for me and to meet the challenge of providing a good education to me with any of the support that I might require. I have a lot of strengths to my name. Not only have I always loved to learn, which has resulted in me becoming a lifelong learner, I am also an avid reader, and I read books every chance I get. I also am very friendly and outgoing, and I'm thankful for the family support I have had throughout my education journey. And the only challenge that I could think of was that basic math and the concept of time increments were the biggest challenges for me throughout my education journey. I did take a year and a half off during my time at Northern Virginia Community College to have a heart transplant. Now, going back to my education journey, here's what worked for me. I did occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy, and had extra help with math when I was in elementary school. Then when I went on to high school, I had more accommodations, which included extra time on tests and schoolwork, study sheets and teacher outlines, and review sessions. I also made sure I had a seat up front to hear the teacher better and see things on the board, and therefore having fewer distractions. I also had occasional check-ins with the case manager and sometimes adjusted timelines. Then came college. Uh, and there are no IEPs during college. So I knew I had to find the disability office and ask for accommodations. And there were lots of accommodations that were available to me if I felt that I needed them. And some of those accommodations that were available were the use of a scribe to take notes, use of a recording pen and a calculator, extra time on tests and assignments, and preferential seating. I occasionally used some of these accommodations, especially preferential seating. So it helped me the most to be successful in college was becoming very familiar with and following the syllabus for each class, being prepared for every class, befriending my professors, and being engaged and actively participating in class. I'll now hand it over to Jess.
Thank you, Charlotte. I wanted to start off by Charlotte sharing a little bit about her education story and some of the things that worked for her. We can go to the next slide. So the purpose of this webinar is to go over the specific learning profile of students with Down syndrome. This is kind of an excerpt from our larger resource, which is Down Syndrome Guidelines for Inclusive Education, that goes into all of this in much more detail. We will share the link to the guidelines resource at the end of the webinar as well. So the purpose of the guidelines It was developed in conjunction with Down Syndrome International and Dr. Sue Buckley to improve early intervention, preschool services, K-12, and post-secondary education. We wanted to make sure that all service providers and educators were informed on these evidence-based practices and share how individuals with Down syndrome have a specific set of traits that affect their learning and development. We want to be able to support the dissemination of this information by hosting webinars and teacher trainings to ensure that educators are aware that these resources exist and to help support them in educating their students who have Down syndrome. Many students with Down syndrome are very strong visual or kinesthetic learners. They have the desire and ability to learn from peers, and they also imitate and take cues from peers. They show strengths in social understanding and relating to others. And this really emphasizes how important inclusion is. It is not just for the academics, it is the ability to learn from peers, their models, following instructions and routines with their same age peers as much as possible throughout the day. So when we go through the learning profile, it is not to say that every single individual with Down syndrome will possess each trait in detail. However, the research does show that the collective number of these traits is represented through the majority of the population. Challenging behaviors can be prevented if they are understood. Communication is the #1 behavior that is affecting our population. Behavior is communication. And so we need to make sure we are giving our students the ability to communicate in a way that is meaningful to them so they can share their frustrations, their needs with us. So there's a wide range of individual differences within the Down syndrome community. As most of us know, we do have population that is capable of being bilingual, trilingual. There is about a 15 to 20% chance that they might have additional or more complex needs, such as an autism diagnosis that is coexisting with Down syndrome. The latest numbers were from 2016 from NIH that states it's about 16% have the dual diagnosis, but that number is really hard to come by because those things aren't necessarily always reported together. I linked a resource that we have on our website that you'll be able to see afterwards if you want to read the study from NIH on how that number was discovered. Also, health issues are very common and may affect learning and development. Many individuals with Down syndrome suffer from sleep apnea. Now we know this, and so children as young as 2 and 3 years old, it is recommended that they have a sleep study. So we're finding this out earlier. But I'd like to stress when I talk to teachers and other adults and parents that we all know how important a great night of sleep is. And if we don't sleep well the night before, our performance at work or in our families is not up to par with what it usually is if we're running on little sleep. So if somebody with Down syndrome has sleep apnea and they haven't had a good night's sleep in weeks, months, years, that is going to affect not only their cognition, their behavior, their attention. So just be aware that there could be other things that might be causing some of these behaviors or issues within school that isn't just directly related to them not wanting to do something. So here is the snapshot of the specific learning profile. We're going to go into each of these sections in detail in the coming slides. This graphic is available on our website. All of our resources are always free and downloadable. This is a great thing to share if you're a parent, to share with your IEP team, if you're a teacher, to share with other educators or specialists that might work with a student with Down syndrome in your school, or even just to be aware of kind of some of these snapshots of what works best for students with Down syndrome. We encourage people to share it in their teacher's lounge, make it posted where everybody who interacts at the school, educators, specialists, administrators can see it. And it just gives them an idea about how visual and kinesthetic learning is a strength, and that students with Down syndrome might have a little bit of challenge when it comes to verbal memory and delayed motor skills. So the first characteristic we'll go over is hearing impairment. 80% of preschool children with Down syndrome experience some level of fluctuating hearing loss. This does not mean that 80% of individuals with Down syndrome have hearing aids or require intervention. It just simply means that they are not hearing at the decibel that many their age are. It can be corrected and doesn't always persist into the school year, but it can persist into school years. With these hearing impairments, it impacts education, which could have an effect on listening to whole class instruction. That kind of touches back to Charlotte's point of having preferential seating. So if you're closer to the teacher, you're more likely to be able to hear what is going on, or closer to if it's something that's being put on a smart board or on some sort of presentation that the student with Down syndrome is in closer proximity. Listening in noisy environments, is there a lot of other sound going on? I think of the cafeteria, where it can be especially noisy. Not only could that affect sensory issues, but that could also impact them being able to differentiate sounds and hear direction, maybe from one person, when there's a lot of other sound going on in the same environment. Processing spoken language, we learn by hearing and watching. So if we're not hearing very clearly, then our processing of what is being told can be impacted. And the same goes with discriminating speech sounds, which impacts phonics. If we're not making the proper sounds when we are learning to talk, it will impact us, the student, being able to decode and differentiate speech sounds and learning phonics. It is very common, and we'll get into it in a little bit, for most, if not all, individuals with Down syndrome to have some sort of speech therapy throughout their life. The next trait is a verbal memory weakness. So students with Down syndrome are not typically auditory learners due to this verbal memory weakness, which is the ability to remember content that is delivered strictly by talking. So what is really important is we include visuals with our instruction, because when a lot of direction is given, maintaining attention is very hard if there's not somewhere to focus, and then retaining instructions. It is recommended that we give short and concise directions to individuals with Down syndrome to ensure that they're able to follow those more simple directions and not go on with, please push in your chair, go get your backpack, put your lunchbox in your backpack, come sit to the carpet and get a book. All of that in one time, likely they might only retain, go get a book. So breaking those directions down into smaller parts, or having a visual in which there's a checklist that they can go through some of those classroom routines. Memorizing sentences is also very difficult if we are looking at retaining information, and consolidating learning into the long-term memory. Repetition is extremely important, and we want to make sure that once a skill is mastered, or a fact or a lesson is mastered, that we do go back and revisit it over time to make sure that the student has retained the information, and that we're looking at different ways in which we can assess students' knowledge. If they're learning new vocabulary and information, are we pairing that with a visual? Are we including, a song or a mnemonic device or something like that for students to help them remember their information without it only just being heard. So delayed motor skills is one of the most distinctive physical characteristics of individuals with Down syndrome. So individuals with Down syndrome have low muscle tone or hypotonia. And hypotonia impacts all muscles in the body. So when we think of motor skills, at least for me, a lot of times my thought goes directly to gross motor, like walking, running, skipping, hopping. But these delayed motor skills impact even the smallest muscles, like the muscles in your fingers when it goes to write, the muscles in your mouth and your tongue on the formation of words. So it really impacts the whole individual with Down syndrome and not just those bigger gross motor areas. So people with Down syndrome, like I mentioned before, often go to speech therapy. And you might notice some individuals with Down syndrome don't have as clear speech as others might be. And that is really due to the low muscle tone. If you think about the placement of your mouth, your lips, your tongue, when you're speaking, that is a lot of motor planning and a lot of different muscles that come into play. And so it's really tough for individuals with Down syndrome, and often they are a little bit delayed in speaking, mainly because of all of that motor planning that has to happen just to simply make sounds that we all sort of do innately without really thinking about, the placement of your tongue on the roof of your mouth or at the tip of your teeth. And it can impact their ability to pay attention for a long time as well, because they're using so many different muscles to get through the day. Writing is also very much impacted with low muscle tone. If you think about when you are writing or you're doing something in school, your feet need to be placed on the ground. You need to be sitting up straight. Your elbow needs to be on the table. You have to have your fingers in a certain place. And all of those involve multiple muscles and motor planning. We have found that when tasks are done later in the day that are heavily reliant on written work, many students with Down syndrome are having behavior issues, and I get phone calls a lot about that. And the majority of the answers is they're mostly tired because they worked all day to use all of these muscles, use all of their brain power. And then when you have to write something at the very end of the day, all of that motor planning and muscle practice can really lead to exhaustion, and you're not getting the true read on what the individual is able to do. Another thing to stress with the delayed motor skills is looking at the assignment and what the purpose of the assignment is. Is the purpose for the child to be able to write a poem, or is the goal of the lesson for the child to be able to, have a 3-stanza poem with rhyming words? And if they can speak that to you or have someone that is scribing, is that measuring their knowledge of the goal? And it is. So really look at some of the work that you're asking these individuals to do in your classroom and see if there's other ways that they can demonstrate their knowledge, because it really isn't always about that written work. It's just what we go to. So if it's a worksheet, maybe they're using flashcards to fill in the blank, or maybe they're using a map and pointing to things for you, rather than having to write out words or write out a story. Can they tell the beginning, middle, and end of a story with a certain number of details? Does it have to be written? And with technology as far as it has come, keyboarding and computer programs are really great. I know a lot of the talk-to-text programs sometimes are a little finicky with our population due to the delay in speech, but they're getting a lot better. And so that's also something to look into for students as they get older, if writing is still a challenge, that they can use some of these talk-to-text programs or have a scribe of some sort, whether it's a peer buddy, a para, or something like that, that is able to help them with work that is typically heavily in written form. So speech and language delay, we kind of went into this a little bit before. Individuals with Down syndrome typically have more receptive language earlier on than expressive language. People with Down syndrome, since they are very visual learners, often will have a high sight word vocabulary from a very young age because they're visual. So they're seeing flashcards and they can match the flashcards, and then they're able to read that word. Expressive language, due to the low muscle tone, makes it a little bit more difficult, but students with Down syndrome are very able to understand what we're saying and act out, even if they're not expressively saying anything. So look at other ways you could receptively ask the question, or is there a way that they could receptively answer something? Possibly preparing them ahead of time. If it is during morning meeting, for example, if they're going to share what they did on the weekend, can you give that task as homework on Friday before to the parents so they can come through and maybe they can have a visual that they can share, or a picture that is emailed that then can go up on the smart board that the teacher can say, oh, did you go to the zoo? And the student can either point to the picture or say yes or no, but they're still able to actively participate within that morning meeting without being put on the spot and feeling as if they have to say something in detail that maybe they're not quite able to do yet. That also falls into difficulty with reading comprehension, speech language, and the verbal memory weakness with reading comprehension is typically an area when we're looking at reading that people with Down syndrome have a little bit more difficulty with. Like I mentioned earlier, sight words are typically a very strong skill, but when it comes to then comprehension and we're asking those WH questions, who was the main character, where did it come from, what's the setting, a lot of times that is a little bit more challenging. And so breaking those down into smaller pieces where maybe they're first only trying to figure out who the character is in many stories. And then you add in a second WH question, but scaffolding it so students are able to chunk that information into smaller bits and then work towards answering multiple questions about the story. Again, pairing these stories and anything we're reading with visuals is a huge, huge important factor to helping students with Down syndrome retain information. In addition to visuals, music is also a great way for younger students. There are some great songs on YouTube by Jack Hartman that they can learn their continents, their states, counting by fives, counting by tens, and it adds that kinesthetic piece of, moving around to music, but also giving them a way to remember the information because it's to the tune of music, and they might not need to expressively sing that, but they will be able to remember that song and the dance and all of that to be able to show you what they are able to do. So visual learning strengths. I've talked about this, I think, on every slide because it is so important that visuals are included in all aspects of not just the school day, but even at home with routines and things like that. People with Down syndrome are strong in watching their peers, looking at modeling, demonstration, imitating. And visuals don't have to necessarily be the text or the cartoony like pictures. For younger students, that is absolutely appropriate if it works for that student, or maybe it's an actual picture of of the item. So say they have to go get their backpack rather than just a generic backpack, it might actually be a picture of their real backpack. Pictures, diagrams, and symbols, that's also a visual. If you're learning the life cycle of a plant, do we have all of those visuals, and maybe instead of using a pencil to fill in the blanks, we have matching words or a word bank or something like that that gives that visual and that little bit of extra information to help the student process what question is being asked. Also, visual schedules are so valuable for most students, not just students with Down syndrome, but many, many students benefit from a visual schedule. And a visual schedule also can be something just as simple as a list. If you have a high schooler, you could just have their schedule printed out with the time, and it could be a checklist or a cross-off list. But being able to see where they are in their day and what's coming next is really helpful, especially when you're looking at transition times, when you don't want something to just come up haphazardly and say, oh, now this is ending and we're going to this, especially if it's going from something that is preferred to something that is not preferred. Digital technologies and apps have been so great for helping us with developing visuals that pair well with many lessons that are being taught. There are several websites that have books that are translated into lower reading levels, but it's the same book that would be age appropriate for the grade level, but being written at the reading level of the student that you're working with, also paired with some pictures that might not be in the book that is being read by the other students in the classroom. The apps are also great for supporting learning. We can use those to help supplement our work. We can use it to help supplement our work and give students, maybe when it's during silent work time, or if they're supposed to be working on a project, there might be an app or some sort of digital exercise that student could be working on to help reinforce the information. So pretty much all people with Down syndrome are impacted by some visual impairment to a degree. Not everybody with Down syndrome wears glasses, but a lot of individuals with Down syndrome do wear glasses, and they do so from an early age. It is common because of low muscle tone for people with Down syndrome to have strabismus, which is commonly, an eye that, a lazy eye. And so that sometimes has to be corrected by surgery, but often glasses are able to fix that. And many people with Down syndrome, wear glasses from a young age and through their life. And it doesn't really impact them, just like it doesn't impact the rest of us who may or may not have to wear glasses. But the visual impairment does impact certain things as it relates to school. Being able to see the discrepancy between white paper with blue lines, the acuity of that is so small. If you look at the paper in front of you that is a typical white sheet of, school paper that has the blue lines, those blue lines and the white, there's not enough contrast for them. And so it makes it really difficult for people to be able to see where that line is. So using something that has black lines or darker lines, or even if you go over a line with a pencil or, a marker to really make those lines more definitive and seen, can really help when you're working on writing and wanting to keep things in a straight line. Also, many teachers, many service providers will often write things for people to trace in like a yellow highlighter. And that is also really difficult to discriminate on a white piece of paper, a yellow highlighter. Those colors are very similar. So if you're going to do that with initiating tracing, think about using maybe a darker highlighter that might be blue or pink or orange, something that is not so light as yellow, or the bubble letters or something else that would be a little bit more discriminatory for the student to be able to see exactly where they're supposed to be in putting their lines or whatever they're working on, shapes, letters, numbers. There is specific research that says that people with Down syndrome learn best by having things in 18-point font and above. So that is something to think about if you notice a student struggling, if it's a textbook, if we still use those anymore, I'm not sure, or if it's something on the computer that maybe is being a little bit smaller. Is there a way for you to zoom in or enlarge the print? That might be a first line of, to try before we put in some other accommodations. Another piece is making sure that maybe if it's hard to visually discriminate from looking up at the board and then down to a paper, is there a way to kind of eliminate so much back and forth to be able to transfer what they're seeing to what they have to record? I encourage families all the time to reach out to their assistive technology department within their district. Often they have so many great computer programs and just apps and devices that really benefit our kids. For example, a touch screen. Maybe a student, the laptop or the computer is too small for them, so they have a larger, touch screen that sits on their desk or a different part in the room in which they're able to navigate with their hand rather than a mouse. Or if they're able to use a mouse, is there an adaptive mouse that might make things a little bit easier and not so tiny for them to be able to manipulate with low muscle tone and difficulty with that visual acuity? You can enlarge the arrow, you can make it a different color. A lot of times there's adapted keyboards as well that are bigger and color coded. So there's really a lot of different options, and our assistive technology departments are typically the best place to go first to ask about those things. And if you're a parent, you can ask for an assistive technology evaluation, or if you're a teacher in the school, you can reach out to whomever is in charge of that for your district and see if they have anything that might be able to help you with anything, not just visual concerns that might impact their access to the education. So in addition to our learning profile graphic that we just went into detail on, and the larger resource, which is our inclusive education guidelines, the guidelines resource is about 75 pages, so it can be rather cumbersome, and I don't recommend that we just plop that on the table to educators or families because it is overwhelming. So what we do have on our website, which we will share the link to all of this at the end, are best practices for students based on kind of their age grade band. So they're about 3 to 5 pages based on each grade band. So for example, early intervention and preschool, we have information on best practices as it relates to the learning profile, but simply for that age group. So that's something that you can share with that early intervention team, share with your preschool along with the learning profile without having to give them the entire large 75 to 80 page document that can be rather overwhelming. Same goes for elementary and middle school. If you have kindergartners, first graders, sometimes I share both the preschool and the elementary. And the elementary one together, because kindergarten sometimes, we might still be having some of the behaviors or support needs or motor needs in elementary school. So it's great to reference back to that if we have some younger elementary students. And then we have one for high school. So really it pulls out those specific things and gives you best practices that relate to how you could work with a student in high school versus a student in preschool, and it's all in one concise, small spot for them. And so, like I said, these are all available on our website for free, and they are great resources to either print out or just email. They're in PDF form to your teachers for them to have a quick information about best practices when it comes to students with Down syndrome. We also have some additional resources. We have a checklist for how inclusive your school is, and this can be used by, very informally, just to see maybe where your school is doing really well and maybe where your school could expand a little bit on their inclusive practices. It gives kind of a lot of different examples of different learning environments and supports, and maybe there are things listed in there that your school has never thought about, so it might be something to try. So this checklist isn't to say, oh, this school is great in inclusion and we're bad. It's really just to give you suggestions on maybe some different ways that you could look at inclusion and where and when it is appropriate for your student. Also, different ways for teaching approaches, lessons. I encourage you, if you have not, if you're an educator, the Universal Design for Learning, all of those web pages are extremely helpful with differentiating instruction. And often it is not just the student with Down syndrome that when you differentiate the lesson, it could benefit another student in your class that may be a visual learner, but maybe doesn't have an IEP that states that, but they might be able to better access information in a different form as well. We also have a one-page resource on models for co-teaching. So it kind of goes into what it looks like if you have a special educator and a general educator in the same classroom in co-teaching. It's not just one group over here and one group over there. There are actually 6 different types of co-teaching that you can try. So this resource just kind of gives a brief overview of what each of those look like. And so it might give you an idea of something that you haven't ever tried before or thought of that might be beneficial to your student to help them access more of that gen ed curriculum in the grade level setting. So on our website, like I mentioned, we have all of those resources. We also have a resource that was developed by Charlotte. It is a self-advocate IEP tips. As our students get older, I mean, from a very young age, they can be involved in their IEP, but especially as they get older and transition starts happening, we want our individuals with Down syndrome to lead their IEPs or have a really important role in it. So Charlotte has done a great job with giving some tips and some suggestions for self-advocates. So if you work with older students with Down syndrome, it would be a great resource to share with them. And then I also just want to make a point to say that, NDSS knows that you know your child best. We are not saying one size fits all for everyone. We just feel that education is a human right, and we want everyone to have the opportunity to an inclusive education and be included to the extent that it is appropriate for them, with giving those supports and modifications first before we move them into a more self-contained environment. So I know we had a lot of questions pop up in the chat, so I'm hoping, I wanted to make sure we left a lot of time for them. So I think Charlotte was maybe gonna ask a question if Amanda gave
So the first one is, could this be applied to inclusion programs, or would you consider this only for mild, moderate classrooms?
No, it could definitely be applied to inclusion programs, to anyone. It really is just this ways that people with Down syndrome might learn best with the way information is presented to them. I think it's really hard sometimes to think outside the box when I'm a former educator, when you have all the pressures of state testing and all of the different ways we have to show that our students are or progressing in each area of the curriculum. But I would definitely say this is appropriate for any setting. I encourage, specialists like the PE teacher, even to just look at that quick graphic, because it just could offer some insight if maybe they're having some challenges or they've never worked with a student with Down syndrome and they're going to be seeing them once a week. It's just a great place to start. So yes, you can use this across all settings, and the learning profile doesn't change. It's the same, throughout life.
And the other one, and the next one is, are there specific differences between receptive and expressive language?
Yeah, so an example of receptive language would be you have 3 flashcards with, dog, cat, cow, and you say, pick dog, and they have to pick the dog. Receptive might be you're asking them to spell, or expressive, excuse me, would be you're asking them to spell dog without any visual cues. So they would have to spell the word. Expressive typically involves less, there can be visuals obviously involved, but receptive language is really when they're able to share their knowledge or identify a skill without having to verbally speak it. I hope that makes sense.
And the next one is, are there any recommendations for good printable visual schedules for preschool aged learners?
That's a great question. Yeah. I know that I've stopped teaching quite a long time ago, but Boardmaker was really popular when I was teaching, but that's typically a district purchase license. I think using clip art is also a great tool to use if you want specific schedules. Off the top of my head, I don't have any websites, but if you shoot me an email, we'll put that on the next screen. I'm more than happy to go through some of my files and see what specific websites that I've used for schedules, because a lot of times they'll have schedules that are, by grade level, like you said, for preschool, or for at home with a home routine or an evening routine. And also with preschoolers, I think actual photos are also a really great way for a visual schedule. If it is lunchtime, take a picture of their lunchbox. If it is, recess, take a picture of your specific playground. That way it's easier to identify and there's not so much generalizing that has to occur for the student to be able to understand what's coming next.
And the next one is, at what age in life should a caregiver begin to investigate if a child has any challenges with their hearing, sight, cardio, etc.?
So typically, individuals with Down syndrome in the first year of life have some sort of evaluation by a cardiologist, since we know over 50% of individuals with Down syndrome have a heart condition. Vision and hearing as well. There is typically a newborn hearing screening. And if the newborn screening is passed, they may or may not have you follow up with an audiologist. I think the important thing to note is individuals with Down syndrome can tend to have smaller ear canals. So they're more likely to have like a wax buildup or need tubes, things like that. So sometimes if you go to an ENT, they might recommend seeing an audiologist to have hearing tested just to make sure that there's nothing else going on. So I would definitely lean towards, your pediatrician or whatever, your general family practice doctor to guide you, and if there is anything with a specialist that would be needed. And obviously, if you're noticing challenges at school, often schools do vision screenings. If they're not passing those, then you might need to go see a specialist.
And I have a few more questions. The next one is, do you recommend the IEP specifically list the learning profile specifics?
I've actually never thought of that before, but I think without necessarily putting like the whole definitions of every single thing, it is important to note that maybe that student learns best by visuals and have that explicitly written in the IEP that there needs to be visuals paired, or look at that accommodations and modifications section of the IEP and maybe go through that checklist with the learning profile beside it and see which types of things might be beneficial to check, or even add in that maybe aren't on that stock list of whatever your district provides for the accommodations and modifications. I think one thing that came up with us is when we look at preferential seating in our art room, there are only stools, not chairs with backs. So we needed to make sure we wrote in the IEP and accommodation due to his low muscle tone. He really needed a back to his chair to support him in participating in art class, things like that. So having that learning profile of saying, oh, you know, we've got low muscle tone, maybe this isn't the best seating arrangement, or, oh, this is a really large classroom. We need to make sure that this student has preferential seating because they may or may not have difficulty not only with auditory processing, but with their vision as well. So I think incorporating parts of it either into the present level page or to the accommodations and modifications page would absolutely be a great idea.
And the next question is, do you think the learning profile can be shared with employers when training employees with Down syndrome? If so, do you have specific suggestions for adults with Down syndrome who are entering the workplace?
Yeah, I think it is definitely would make sense to share this with an employer. We do at NDSS, and I can have Amanda share that link as well. We do have a lot of employment resources for employers as well as families. And I think when you're looking at someone with Down syndrome entering the workforce, and like I said in the beginning, not every individual with Down syndrome has every single one of, you know, the challenges and strengths that is on the learning profile, but looking at the individual person and the type of job that they're going to be entering and helping that employer ahead of time, maybe pre-plan some ideas. So if it's a job that requires multi-step for something, maybe there is, you know, some visual paired with that. Is it something that is going to require them to read on a computer screen and it's small, so you might need to increase the font size? I think working with your employer and making sure that it's clear where, you know, the individual with Down syndrome needs those supports and help. But our employment resources would be a great place to start. And if you shoot me an email, if you have more specific employment questions, I can absolutely get you in touch with our employment program team to answer those.
And another one is, do you have any tips on how to make a school setting more inclusive to kids with Down syndrome?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, Charlotte, we say this all the time, right? Presume competence and give the opportunity. I think it's really hard when we're set in our ways of how we've always done things, but really just kind of embracing everybody's differences and you know, the world is not a segregated world. So if our kids are not around people with Down syndrome as they get older and they enter the workforce, they might not understand, you know, that people with Down syndrome are capable of doing great things. And like Charlotte, graduating from George Mason University with a college degree. And so really just looking for places in your school in which, or people that are open-minded, that are willing to try some different teaching styles, different approaches to things, and really making sure that people with Down syndrome and other disabilities feel like they have a meaningful place and that they belong. Inclusion is so much more than just putting them in a classroom. It's that sense of belonging. And do they have meaningful relationships? Do they feel like they belong there, or are they othered? You know, if your student is more in a self-contained class, do they start off their day in the gen ed class like all of their peers and then move to, you know, when they need more support for special education? You know, technically special education is a service. It's not a place. And I think often that kind of gets a little bit blurred. But, you know, for other students to know that students with Down syndrome are actually in their classroom, but they might have times of the day that they get removed to have some extra support, but are they being presented as a member of that classroom community, and do they feel valued in that classroom, I think is really important. Was that it, Charlotte?
As far as I know, yes.
Well, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to come out today and learn more about the specific learning profile for students with Down syndrome. The recording of this, along with follow-up links, will be sent in the next day or so. And the recording will also be on our YouTube channel as well. So you can feel free to share that with anyone who you might think would benefit from this information. And if you work for a school or a school district and are interested in a more detailed type of training, please feel free to reach out. Amanda, I think, yep, there's the education@ndss.org email that goes straight to me. So I am more than happy to give you to talk through maybe if there's some sort of professional development that might benefit your school or your district. And Charlotte and I would be more than happy to tailor something that would work for you. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.